We hope to have you join us for our next event, joint event, which is Monday, August 15th here at Silicon Valley Bank, featuring Rick Belluzzo, a high-tech executive formerly with HP and Microsoft. He's going to talk about building a culture of success. Later in the program, we'll have time for your questions. And when it's time for questions, we ask that you walk up to the microphone to my right. And at this time, we ask that you kindly silence all your phones. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Steve Blank. Steve spent more than 20 years in the tech industry and authored 4 books, including 4 Steps to the Epiphany, considered the book that launched the lean startup movement. He shifted from being an entrepreneur to teaching entrepreneurship to undergraduate and graduate students at Berkeley, Stanford, Columbia, NYU, and UC San Francisco. He created the National Science Foundation Innovation Corps, now the standard for science commercialization in the US, and his Hacking for Defense class at Stanford is revolutionizing how the US defense and intelligence community can deploy innovation with speed and urgency. Steve writes a weekly blog for the Wall Street Journal, Accelerators, and hosts Entrepreneurs Are Everywhere, a weekly radio show on Sirius XM. Along with outstanding teaching awards from Stanford University and UC Berkeley, he has been named one of the top 10 influencers in Silicon Valley. The Harvard Business Review listed him as one of the masters of innovation, and in 2013, Forbes listed him as one of the 30 most influential people in tech. Joining Steve on stage is Joe Felter, Senior Research Scholar at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation, and a Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Steve Blank and Joe Felter.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks, Rob. All right, well, I guess I will kick it off. First, thanks to the Commonwealth Club and the Idea to IPO for hosting, and thanks especially for Steve joining us. He's had, like every day, a very busy day. So I want to make one disclaimer before I start moderating a few questions and open it up to the group. I am not entirely objective and impartial. I've had a great privilege of working with Steve Blank these last few months in the course. And in my short introduction, although I'm trying to masquerade as an academic now, the previous 30 years I spent in the military and in the special forces community, where I had a chance to work with some amazing, inspirational leaders. Some folks you've heard of, like General McChrystal, General Petraeus. A lot of folks you haven't, but I'll tell you, working with Steve Blank it's been an inspiration for me, and just to see what a difference he's making on so many levels, and it's hard to keep up. You want the money now or later? It's hard to keep up, but anyways, I'll try to be objective. So let me kick off to the top of the evening. So Steve, Hacking for Defense. It's kind of an odd name for a class. I mean, what is Hacking for Defense?
So the idea of hacking for defense is, the shorthand is how to kind of put the best and the brightest students we could find in the U.S. against a set of really pressing national security problems to make the country safer and more secure. And we figured out how to do that by essentially crowdsourcing the best students we could find and gathering up the most important problems that our Department of Defense and Intelligence community can have, and putting them together in a formal class.
And how does it work? I mean, you bring all these bright people in a classroom, throw your tested methodology. What's the secret sauce?
Well, the good news is the sauce isn't secret, but the problem has never been attacked this way. If we all read the newspaper, we kind of understand the problems our military and intelligence community are dealing with in the 21st century are completely, as you lived, are completely different than the ones they had in the 20th century. In the 20th century, we were dealing with nation states that, we built missiles, they built missiles. We built X, they built X, mostly Soviet Union and some other threats. And therefore, our military was used to essentially long lead time items. We built aircraft carriers that took decades to deploy, and we built new aircraft systems that, again, operated over decades, and we built missile systems, the same thing. The threats emerged and were there for decades. Nowadays, all you need to do is read the newspaper and think about ISIS is actually adopted lean startup techniques. They train in cyberspace. They buy stuff on eBay. They pay each other through PayPal. They communicate through Telegraph and Messenger. And you're lucky if a third of the people in the DoD even know what those apps are we just talked about. And more importantly, they're not building aircraft carriers or permanent bases, et cetera. And at the same time, in the threats like the South China Sea, or potential threats, asymmetry is the threat that we face. That is, we built aircraft carriers for 75 years to project power in the Western Pacific, and all of a sudden we have a potential adversary that said, well, we're not going to match you aircraft carrier to aircraft carrier, at least not now. We're going to build ICBMs with precision-guided weapons that could actually land on a deck of a carrier and disable a carrier with one shot. That's never happened before. Now all of a sudden a $500,000 missile could take out a $5 billion aircraft carrier, complete asymmetry. And someone has been thinking asymmetrically and thinking at speed in a way we just haven't. And so with that observation, meaning that the U.S. is facing threats in the 21st century at speed and urgency that it never had, the question was, could you in fact give our Department of Defense and intelligence community some resources they never had? Well, in Silicon Valley, we've been operating at speed for about 50 years, 24/7. Pivots and changes and agility is the nature of our game. And in fact, that's no longer just a Silicon Valley technique. It's the technique of entrepreneurs everywhere, and certainly entrepreneurs in almost every research university in the U.S. So to answer your question, it was how can we take those students and match them with these islands of innovation inside our Department of Defense and intelligence community. And the point is, there are people inside the DoD and intel community not only understand the problem, but are actually trying to operate at speed. And we decided to see if we could help them. So to answer your question, you and Pete Newell, who were the other instructors, and I went out to the Department of Defense and intel community and asked them if there were some problems they would like us to work on and to hand off to some students to see within 10 weeks if we could actually have those students understand the problem, understand the potential solution, and build what we call minimum viable products and actually deliver first pass solutions to those agencies. And so the first question was, could we even get any of those sponsors not to laugh at us hysterically without saying, well, you got students, academia, what are you going to do with military problems? And good news is that both Pete and Joe had enormous credibility in their military career, that people took us quite seriously. And in fact, we had to cut off the number of problems at 25 because we were only going to have 8 teams. And so we got 8 teams from a variety of military and intelligence community departments and agencies. And then we recruited students who were interested in working on those problems. And that was the beginning of the class. So was that your question, or did I answer another one?
You got it. We're going to get some more on that similar topic. But Steve, you've worked with former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry on the commercial side, and you've written in...
My first startup in Silicon Valley was a company called ESL, which Bill Perry was the founder and CEO a long, long time ago.
And it came full circle for our
Full
class.
circle about a month ago. First of all, he was the sponsor of our class, a course advisor, and then I got to interview him last month at Stanford, which was a real honor for me.
And so you've written, and there's some great, I think it's a YouTube video on the secret history of Silicon Valley. You've written about the DoD's relationship with Silicon Valley decades ago. A lot has changed. And what has changed? What was it like back then? What's changed and why?
So I don't want to get history on all of you, but it's probably worth about 30 seconds for most of you who don't know is, the United States in World War II in the U.S. did something dramatically different for science and technology than any other country did. And that is we actually harnessed civilians in universities to build weapon systems. It's a big idea. Any of you associated with universities now? Anybody in the audience? Some of you, come in, you raise your hand. It turns out it's hard to imagine, but pre-World War II, the U.S. government never gave $1 of federal money to U.S. universities, none. There were no federal research grants, nothing. All that changed in World War II when a single entrepreneur went to the President of the United States just before the war broke out and said, this is going to be a technology war, and our U.S. military weapons labs aren't sufficient for us to win that war. Well, you can imagine what the U.S. military weapons labs thought about that. The Army said, no, we can make the best guns, and the Navy said, no, we got the best ships. And the Army Air Force, which was part of the Army, said, no, our planes are best. And this guy, his name was Vannevar Bush, went to Roosevelt and said, no, in universities, we have the best science, and we're happy to help build better weapon systems than the military could come up with. And so there was a big debate, and they decided to cut the baby in half and say the U.S. military could work on existing weapon systems, and our scientists, who were civilians, were going to be tasked by the military to develop advanced weapon systems. And they set up something called the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSR&D. Make a long story short, we invested over $10 billion 2016 dollars in research and development in World War II for a set of weapons. And we divided that up into 19 different problem sets. We invented something called radar in the US. Rockets at Cal. No, radar was MIT. Caltech was rockets. There was another project in physics in Berkeley that had an interesting intersection over Los Alamos first and then over Japan, which was nuclear weapons. And basically, we use science and technology to build weapon systems. The reason why I tell you this history is that post-World War II, the U.S. didn't stop funding universities to build weapon systems. In fact, we doubled down on that. And during the Cold War, every university in the United States that had a research department had a secret weapon systems program for the U.S. Department of Defense or intelligence community. And herein goes the Stanford story. So Stanford, up to 1968, had a 400-persons weapons lab inside the engineering school, building electronic warfare, electronic countermeasures, and spaceborne intelligence systems. And Stanford basically, which was the core of our entrepreneurship culture in Silicon Valley, had been funded by the CIA, NSA, Air Force, Army, and Navy to build these systems. And so our culture for innovation and entrepreneurship basically started in World War II and considered and kept going all the way through the Vietnam War, when finally the riots on the Stanford campus during the war forced all classified military research off of campus since then. If anybody's interested, there's a YouTube video called The Secret History of Silicon Valley that you might want to check out, which is the canonical history of military in the Valley. It's brilliant. It's actually mine. So you're supposed to laugh here.
It's great.
So was that your question?
It's great, Steve. We're going to follow that. Staying in history, I saw a T-shirt the other day that said, USA, back-to-back World War champions. Hey, we've done pretty well with the way we've handled defense innovation.
I'd rather say back-to-back peace champions.
Okay. Didn't quite fit the shirt of the guy that was wearing it, but probably a better way of saying it. So we've done okay. We've had some challenges recently, but why do you think it's important to change the way we innovate in our defense department and our intelligence organizations?
The problem is our adversaries are not working through our acquisition and procurement system. And that's somewhat of a sad joke if you think about how long it takes for something to be acquired and deployed in U.S. Department of Defense. As I said, those systems were built to meet adversaries, were decades-long acquisition systems from I have a need till I could field a system was the norm. And people have been arguing about this, I think, since the days of Valley Forge, where Washington was probably complaining about this. But for the first time, we're dealing with adversaries and potential adversaries that are using different rule books. One of our co-instructors who you've been working with for years is Pete Newell, who ran what was called the Army's Rapid Equipping Force. And during the Iraq and Afghanistan war, soldiers were getting killed by roadside bombs, and both when they were on vehicles and then off in Afghanistan when they were dismounted. And we actually had no counter IED technology. And so the U.S. military stood up or formed a group called the Rapid Equipping Force that kind of cut through the decade-long acquisition and procurement system. And we didn't even have any of these counter systems. And Pete went out to the best technology companies in the world and acquired technology that could be rapidly deployed in months. It turned out that was still too long because people were being killed in those months, but at least it was the beginning of a notion of the military understanding that there needed to be a way for rapid deployment of solutions.
We certainly underscored the need for some change in the way we innovate in these organizations. So let me bring it down to the actual course itself. I'm at Stanford, I've been there a few years, and Steve, you teach a wildly popular course, the Lean Launchpad course, where students apply in teams of 4, basically to build a company,
right,
and with the hopes of building it, growing it, scaling it, selling it, and this is Stanford, this is get rich you, as that article said. So it's pretty easy to see the motivation for students to apply to that course, and it's always oversubscribed. What's the motivation for students to come to Hacking for Defense, to solve someone else's problem?
So you know what, Joe, it's almost worth going back and thinking about. It's very funny hearing you describe the Lean Launchpad class as kind of the standard norm, because when I first came up with it, it's only about 6 years old, it was one of the most heretical classes in academia. And in fact, when we came up with
Someone like you, Steve.
when we came up with the Lean Startup method, I mean, the total available market of people who believed in that was 1. It was me. And then when I convinced Eric Ries, then the total available market became 2 of us. And so it's, I just want to remind the audience is that these things were not commonly believed or understood at the time. So, Lean Startup, just for reminders, if there's anybody in this room who hasn't heard about it, just basically says, look, the old way we would build and fund companies is at its core, Silicon Valley in the 20th century and entrepreneurship in general never said these words, but acted as startups are just smaller versions of large companies. That's a big idea. Everything that large companies did, your investors would tell you as a founder of a startup to do. They write business plans, you write business plans. They hire VPs of engineering and sales and marketing on day 1, you need to do that. They write that plan, they execute to that plan, they go alpha test, beta test, first customer ship, and the only problem you're going to have is you're building big enough to put all the bags of money that would come. And for 25 or 30 years in the 20th century, we were surprised that the world did not play out that way for startups and entrepreneurs. Because the reality was startups weren't smaller versions of large companies, but we didn't even have a language to describe how they were different. It turns out that large companies execute what are called known business models. In a large company, it got large because you understood who your customers were, what they needed, you understood competitors and pricing and distribution channel. That's the sum of all those things. It's called a business model. You knew that stuff. So when you wanted to launch a new product in an existing company, you had a series of knowns. But in a startup, what we never understood is a startup isn't an execution problem. You're actually searching for a business model. Unlike a large company where you have facts, in a startup, all you have, as I remind my students at Stanford, is a set of untested hypotheses. And I also remind them the reason why I use the word hypotheses is because they're paying $50,000 a year. Outside of Stanford, the word hypotheses is just guess. And in a startup, it's actually, you're just effing guessing. And so if you really think about it, a startup is nothing more than a series of untested hypotheses. Maybe coming in with some known tech, but the odds are if you're a tech-driven startup, you don't have a clue about customers, you're just guessing. What's worse, in the old days, you'd hire a VP of sales who told you what a great Rolodex they had and would go off in some tangent which really didn't match your new technology. Or you might have some customer insight, but you had no idea whether the tech was going to work or not. The point being is that startups were not only riskier than existing companies, they were riskier because of this lack of facts. But again, we didn't have this language. And so the Lean Startup came out of, number 1, just observing the distinction between search and execution. And then number 2, observing that for the last 100 or so years since Harvard started the MBA program in first graduating class 1908, we built a management stack of tools for execution. You get a master of business administration, big idea, administration, learning in the 20th century about a set of tools to manage and administer an existing corporation. but we had no tool set. Think about it. No tool set in Silicon Valley to manage the search for a business model. Well, no one had ever even articulated that. They said, no, go write a 5-year plan, see, and my light bulb went on that said, no business plan survives first contact with customers, right? If you've ever done a startup, you write the plan to get funding and then you throw it in the drawer and then go do what you really need to go do. And so what I realized is we needed a tool set to search for business models, and that tool set became just 3 components. One is I adopted the work of someone named Alexander Osterwalder, who managed to get this whole idea of business model on a single sheet of paper, which we call business model canvas. And we use that to frame hypotheses, to write them all down. 2 is my contribution to the lean startup method was what do you do to test those hypotheses? And there was the second kind of corollary for lean startups that says, number 1 was no business plan survives first contact with customers. Second corollary is there are no facts inside your building, so get the hell outside. That is, from day 1, the day you write down those hypotheses, I don't want you talking to your peers inside the building. That's just, I won't even use what the phrase that is, but in a mixed audience, but that is not productive. You need to get out of the building and actually start testing your hypotheses with customers, partners, channel, et cetera. And that's called customer development, and that's my contribution. And the third contribution Eric Ries made was understanding that engineering in the 21st century was not the traditional waterfall model of alpha, beta, first customer ship, but was actually something very different that we've learned how to build software and hardware for, called agile engineering, where we build things iteratively and incrementally. And so those 3 parts, business model design, customer development, and agile engineering, is what is called the lean startup. So when you hear that phrase, that's kind of what we invented and most startups kind of use now in the 21st century. But we still had no way to teach this. Now, to slowly answer your question, about 6 years ago, I realized that while we were kind of preaching about lean and we wrote books about lean and some startups were kind of doing lean, the capstone class in universities, capstone meaning the kind of the higher and best class you could take for entrepreneurship, was still how to write a business plan. I thought there was a huge mismatch between, well, wait a minute, we kind of know that's wrong for startups, but why are we still teaching that? And the answer was because we had no other class. And so Stanford was nice enough to allow me to kind of kick over the table and create a whole new class. And this was this Lean Launchpad class, which said, no, business plans are actually inane to be teaching to entrepreneurs. We ought to teach them just like they learn in the real world, was build a class that taught all 3 lean components, but teach it experientially like you were actually going through a startup from day 1. And so to kind of summarize a very long process, the Lean Launchpad class, as you said, has teams of students come in with their own ideas in teams of 4. Every week we teach them something about a business model. What's a channel? What's a customer? How do you get, keep, and grow customers? What's a partner? What are costs? But every week, teams get outside of our classroom and have to talk to 10 to 15 customers a week and build what we call a minimum viable product. That is a iterative and incremental version of what they think the solution is for that customer. And so every week, teams come in and present. Here's what we thought, here's what we did, here's what we found, and here's our minimum viable product. And think about it. A team taking a full graduate course load talks to over 100 customers and partners and builds over 8 or 10 minimum viable products in the span of 10 weeks. Now, the good news is, I thought this was a good idea, and the teams who won't go through it are kind of survivors of the class, but at the same time, I got a call from the National Science Foundation who had seen the class and said, you've just invented the scientific method for entrepreneurship. Given it was the National Science Foundation, I thought that was an interesting comment. And I said, why? He said, well, all you're doing is teaching these teams how to do hypothesis testing, except outside the classroom. Scientific method is all about hypothesis testing. We're trying to commercialize science, and we've been doing this for 30 years under something called the SBIR and STTR program. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but the U.S. government gives grants to any scientist who's doing basic research in the U.S., typically tenured faculty and their grad students, But for the last 30 years, they kind of whispered to me, is the dirty secret is we've been giving out cars without requiring driver's ed, and surprised they all crash. Meaning they had no methodology to teach these scientists at all. They were just handing them grants and saying, build companies. And so the NSF in the last 5-6 years now adopted this class. I modified the curriculum very slightly. It's now called the NSF Innovation Core. It's taught in 53 universities, including here, Berkeley, Stanford, UCSF in the Bay Area. And we've put over 1,000 teams of the country's best scientists and their grad students through this. This was all the precursor to Hacking for Defense. So if you remember, me kind of struggling with this notion of the country needs to apply our best and brightest to national defense and intelligence problems, I realized that if we just simply took this National Science Foundation I-Core curriculum, and it's called the Lean Launchpad when taught in universities, if in fact, instead of students coming in and working on their problems, what we just simply had was we listed the problems and saying, anybody kind of interested in working on national security problems? And that was a big risk. Risk one was seeing if we could get the problems. And if you remember sitting around going, I don't know, we'll see if anybody kind of applies for the class. Because, defense, maybe, people think we're making bombs or, whatever, better weapons, which weren't the goal of the class. And just as to give you a tease, that my class, which seats 32 students in my regular entrepreneurship class, usually has 50 or 60 applicants. And so it's considered, at Stanford, where there's like 17 other entrepreneurship classes, that's considered a pretty good backlog. And so I got to tell you, Joe and I and Pete were kind of sitting seeing would anybody apply for this class, going, can we fill up 32 seats? Maybe we'll take 4 teams. What's the minimum number we'll have? We had 75 students apply for the class. And more importantly, we had students from around the world start emailing us saying, how can we help? And then we had other parts of the DoD and intelligence community start emailing us. And not only how can we help, how can you teach this inside our agency or department or something else? And so we've been stunned. So I think I answered that question.
So Steve, staying at the class level, could you highlight some of the problems that the students worked on, the sponsors they worked with, and maybe comment, what do you think were some of the big takeaways, the big ideas that both the students maybe took away from the class, the sponsors, and even you and the teaching team?
I think the explosive ordnance disposal problem was a good one.
That one 3-letter agency.
And in fact, you should talk about that one, the Navy divers and Navy SEALs diver problem. Which they thought the problem was X on day one, and then discovered that the problem was Y. In fact, should I talk about that one?
That sounds great. And maybe some comment on what was the outcome? Was it solving the problem, or maybe I don't want to tee you up too much there?
So if you remember what I said is that these teams weren't working on their own problems. They were working on problems that sponsors inside of military departments, agencies, groups said there's a real problem we need to solve. And the deal was that if you were going to give us a problem, the sponsor had to say, and I'll be your guide to interviewing people inside my division, group, agency, et cetera, because I understand you need to talk to a large number of these people. But here's the problem, this is the problem, it's well understood, help us solve this with speed. And the most interesting, not the one, they were all very interesting. We got one from the Navy, from Navy SEALs. Would you remember which group it was?
Naval Special Warfare Development Group, or it was a group out of Hawaii.
Out of Hawaii. And they said, Navy doctors said the biggest problem is we don't have enough instrumentation on the Navy SEAL divers about their physiological health and state. And so we need more instrumentation that would give us these more parameters. And this was coming from the Navy doctors and researchers. And so this team signed up. That sounds pretty interesting. We'll get to make sensors and Internet of Things stuff, and we get to talk to Navy SEALs and whatever. And within the first week, they started getting out of the building and actually started talking to Navy SEALs, who essentially said, and I think these guys meant it, over my dead body, or I'm going to let those doctors know I'm not fit to dive. Meaning, yes, the doctors wanted X, but the users went, no effing way. And in fact, if this would have been some other project, it would have ended there. But because of this customer discovery process, the teams were trained to ask, so what's really your most pressing problem? And they said, which found hard to believe. Well, we really don't know where we all are in 3D space underwater. We kind of know you dumped us all out of the sub and directionally we need to go here, but we don't know where each other is. Well, why is that? Well, our little sub has to get within 6 feet of the surface for us to get a kind of a GPS reading. Gee, could you guys invent some buoy or device to actually, while we're swimming around, help us figure out where we are? And so almost immediately they found that, number one, the problem as articulated by one group really wasn't the most pressing problem, and those researchers didn't even understand that. And two is that this team actually worked with the divers, and they were, there's great photographs of them in the class, kind of decked out in SEAL team, diving equipment. They actually built underwater buoys and delivered a prototype or several prototypes during the week. There's great film of them testing this underwater in the Stanford swimming pool, releasing these buoys and trying to get them to work. And at the end, I think that project is still going on.
It is, yeah.
The other one is the explosive ordnance device problem. It turns out there's a group called JIDA. Is that the group?
It is. It is. Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Agency.
Which basically, a big problem in Iraq and Afghanistan for our troops is diffusing roadside bombs for taking out vehicles and dismounted soldiers. And we had a pretty sophisticated group doing that. But then when we left Iraq, it was now up to the Iraqis to do this. And there was a real need, JIDA thought, in providing the Iraqis with additional equipment, monitoring, language translation on how to defuse bombs. And people had all these thoughts about the technical solutions that we needed to give our Iraqi allies. And so the team signed up thinking they were making some language translator and whatever. And they were going to deliver these great pieces of hardware and software and networks and satellites and whatever. And by the end of the class, they realized that wasn't the problem at all, that the Iraqis had everything they needed. And in fact, what was really missing was an organizational problem, is JIDA wasn't organized to talk and get the right data in. Is that a fair summary? And in fact, the deliverable in that case was not a product at all, but was a white paper suggestion to the commander about how they should be reorganizing to kind of save lives, because they had all the data they needed, it just wasn't being communicated to each other. And while the team thought they had failed, they had actually succeeded, because they thought their job was to build a product. And in fact, their job was actually to solve a problem. And they did so in a very convincing way. Joe, any others you want to talk about?
So, Steve, that one 3-letter agency I thought was pretty interesting that they were talking to them at all. And I remember some 11 p.m. midnight emails coming across, but that was Pacific time, coming from D.C. Just comment, I thought it was a huge achievement to even engage that organization, but maybe were there any lessons learned from dealing with sensitive information that with the students that you think is worth highlighting?
No.
Okay, good answer.
So the real surprise is that the National Security Agency is struggling with as well, is how do you kind of engage external resources in a way that obviously they could scrub problems that are still useful when worked on in students that don't. And by the way, just as an aside, we had to design the class, ready for this, that the teams could be composed of foreign nationals, meaning students from countries, China, India, across the world, Israel, were all on these teams working on these problems, and no government agency, including the National Security Agency, had a problem with that. Why? Because we had designed the class with the sponsors to make the problem set kind of clean. And but a good number of these agencies, as I said, including the NSA, have realized that they need to figure out how to get outside innovation kind of connected inside, because the rate of innovation happening out here and happening in universities are at times faster than their internal innovation. I just want to remind some of you who, any of you been in the military or DOD or work? You can raise your hand. Come on. No one? Really? It turns out that another thing that's a little interesting to note is in the 20th century, our military and intelligence community owned a series of technologies that were magic. And in fact, we had such technology superiority that no one could touch it. In fact, Joe, you tell that story when you jumped out of the plane over Grenada. What were you carrying? These advanced, amazing things that no one else ever had.
Sure, night vision goggles, GPSs, these just, amazing technology that only a superpower like the United States could pay a lot of money and provide its most elite forces, which is now a credit card and an internet connection, you can outfit a.
And what did you lose that you were worried about?
Yeah, I lost a piece of overhead imagery of our objective. It was actually jumping into Panama in '89, and this was classified at the very high level, and if you lost it, you were in big trouble. And I'm more worried about losing that sensitive item than the green tracers coming through the canopy. I won't make a political comment, but we take our security classification very seriously in the military, and I was going to be in big trouble if I lost it.
So if you really think about all the stuff you were armed with, 20 years later, you buy off the shelf or you get for free.
Yeah.
Right? That classified information is Google Earth with probably better resolution. GPS is built into your iPhone or Android device, and night vision goggles you could buy on Amazon, still very expensive, but you could get them off the shelf. That's just the most obvious stuff. But if you're, and let's take our favorite, to fly a drone. Are you kidding? A drone was a $20 million device. Now, I predict in 5 years we're going to see them smashing into each other over Silicon Valley about every 20 minutes in the density of drones, and they're just going to get better and faster. And just the point that what we used to take as military sensitive technology has been commoditized at a speed and a rate that just seemed improbable decades ago, which again is another reason to be connecting our defense and intelligence community into outside resources.
So Steve, I don't know what your hypothesis going into the course was, but was there a big surprise? What was the biggest surprise coming out of the course for you?
Actually, a couple. So there were three surprises. I talked in kind of separate items about the things we were surprised at. One was the big hypothesis was, could we get the DoD and intelligence community to think this was a good idea at all? Like, what do you mean, give some students problems? And we got dedicated people working on this. Well, as I said, there were islands of innovation who got it in faster than we did. They went, listen, this class is not the solution, it's a solution, and there were lots of people welcoming that solution. And so I was pleasantly surprised the number of sponsor problems we got, and after class, we'll talk about in a second what happened. The second one is, Stanford was a university that had riots on the campus about military involvement in 1968. And some people as old as I am still remember that this was not a campus that welcomed participation, even though it was kind of in its DNA. And I was surprised that I had more students applying for this entrepreneurial class than I think any other probably on campus. So that was two. Number three is, which was a goal and we hadn't talked about, but I will kind of tell the audience, Joe, was, part of my other agenda in doing this class was creating another venue for national service for students. Once we ended the military draft in the United States, I just had a personal feeling, having served 4 years during Vietnam, that we disconnected the body populace from any political or foreign policy decisions because no one had any skin in the game. And the only national service you get to do is either volunteer for the military, big commitment, or maybe you do Teach for America or AmeriCorps. But there really was no way to do national service for Department of Defense or Intel community if you wanted to, or if you believed that was something important to do for the country. And so for me, there was kind of this notion of I wanted to create something that hopefully could scale, which was the last piece of this, across the country. If you remember, I mentioned the last time I started a class, it became something that was adopted by the National Science Foundation and now had north of 1,000 teams, so that's close to, 3,000-4,000 people through it. I wanted to do the same for this class. I wanted to see if not only could we teach it at Stanford, but can we get it adopted and scaled at scale to all research universities in the United States. And so that was the design from day one. And I had kind of hoped that some schools would be interested, and because we first taught it in January, right? The class ended May?
June? Yeah, early June.
Early June.
June 1.
We got 20 schools now signed up, and we got the National Defense University going to go fund this thing at scale. And I think my goal of having 50 universities in 5 years is too pessimistic. I think we might have them in 3 years. And we're teaching the first Hacking for Defense Educators course September 7th through 9th here at Stanford. And this is the first time we're going to say this. There's actually a publisher who's going to publish our book called Hacking for Defense early next year. So it looks like this thing might actually take off and actually make an impact for helping our country move at speed and with speed and urgency.
So Steve, with this additional data, what do you think are the biggest challenges and also the biggest opportunities for the Defense Department, intelligence community, other government agencies in working with Silicon Valley and other innovation hubs?
You know, the Department of Defense, Secretary of Defense kind of realized that, you know, they were so Washington-centric that they really were connected to great contractors along the Beltway, but really had no outpost in Silicon Valley. And so he set up something called DIUX, Defense Unit Experimental, out here, which was essentially an innovation outpost to do what Pete Newell did with the Army's Rapid Equipping Force, and to connect the DoD, Department of Defense, with all the technical assets and companies that could help. And then the light bulb went on that said, well, wait a minute, it's not only Silicon Valley, we should have outposts in Boston and Austin and other places of technology innovation around the country. And of course, if you were a congressman, you probably wanted one in your district as well. But the point being is that it kind of breaks the lock of that innovation only comes from, you know, billion-dollar contractors, that there actually might be some innovation inside of small startups and inside of universities, et cetera. And DIUX ended up to be a huge supporter of this class. And one of the interesting outcomes is not only did the Secretary of Defense put an outpost in Silicon Valley, but the Secretary of State followed. And they have an outpost here for trying to find technology to help policy and diplomacy. And surprisingly, that individual, Zivka Krieger, sat through our Hacking for Defense class and decided that what state needed was a Hacking for Diplomacy class. That is taking the exact same framework, but instead of working on DoD and intel community problems, working on State Department problems. And I'm proud to announce, you'll hear it here first, is that we're actually launching Hacking for Diplomacy at Stanford in September. And so we'll be offering Hacking for Defense and Hacking for Diplomacy at Stanford, and hopefully scaling that to multiple universities across the country as well.
Steve, I think we have time for maybe one more question from me, and we'll turn it over to the audience. But I suspect there's a lot of entrepreneurs in the audience, people that have startups. It seems here we are in Silicon Valley. Steve, any advice to a startup CEO that thinks they may have a technology with dual use? Should they be more encouraged or less encouraged about working with the DoD and the government based on your recent experience?
Well, you know, Silicon Valley companies historically, when they heard government customer, ran the other way unless they were designed to work with the U.S. government, because the paperwork and bureaucracy and time to get, you know, stuff done usually went public by the time you had your first order. That's kind of changed, and it's changed not evenly distributed, meaning some parts of the DoD is still like dealing with 1950s government, but some parts of the DoD and intel community work like the 21st century. And so if I was a startup, I'd certainly be looking at talking to DIUX and other parts of the innovation community inside the Department of Defense. And they are looking for commercial off-the-shelf stuff. In fact, they got it. They'd rather buy something that's actually funded by commercial companies than having you build something very specific for them. That's actually been a great insight, I think, from them and for startups.
Thanks, Steve. Well, I'm sure we have a lot of questions, so I'm not sure who wants to moderate that, but...
We moved the mic over here, so if you have a question, kindly come up, line up, and speak into the mic, and Joe and Steve will take your questions. So come on down.
Now we're giving prizes for the best question.
Hi, Steve. My name is Ricardo. I'm a big fan of you, Eric Ries, and Lean Startup. And I always had this question since I read your books. So basically, the entrepreneurs, everybody says it's like a person that never give up. And at the same time, the Lean Startup or like all this movement, there is a concept behind like trying to build fast and fail fast.
So fail fast isn't something I promote. So learn fast.
Okay. So I always been trying to find the intersection between these two things.
Yeah, well, there is no intersection. If you believe fail fast is a goal, then that's you're kind of predestined to fail. What you want to think is your goal is to learn fast. That's much different than fail. Fail fast means, I really don't have much tenacity or resilience and I'm going to give up. The whole idea about building minimum viable products and learning quickly is so I could learn, pivot, or just iterate and keep moving forward, not failing.
Okay, so like the initial hypothesis that you make, which can guide you through during your learn process,
Yep.
guide you through exactly another problem or a different product or another business. So that's how I would consider kind of failing. So so basically you're saying just keep on learning and.
So if you have no framework, lean is not just a set of words, it really is a methodology. If you're not using the business model canvas, customer development, and agile engineering, you're just using some buzzwords and not a process. So if you go and tell me you're using a business model canvas, I don't mean to beat you up, but just to answer your question, business model canvas allows you to start looking in some detail about what hypotheses am I testing. It's not how do I throw some other business against the wall because my ideas didn't work for 3 weeks. It means I actually am running through a fairly formal method. One of the things that lean has done is give people excuses for attention deficit disorder. And again, I don't mean you, but I just mean in general, entrepreneurship is actually requires an enormous amount of rigor and tenacity and resilience, and now has a framework to do it. So I would suggest you might want to read some of the stuff about business model and look at Osterwalder's stuff. Once you have that framework, it allows you to kind of keep focused for a while. Okay?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good question.
Hey, as far as the hacking for defense concept, one of the things that kind of immediately springs to mind, hearing about the concept is this idea of engineering clinics that exist in a number of colleges and universities already. I'm not sure if you're familiar with, and I guess the obvious distinction is working directly with government rather than working with industry, but I'm wondering if there are kind of other differences in your approach from kind of what would typically be done in those sorts of programs.
Yeah, so one is, remember I mentioned the business model canvas? Yeah, so one is we modified it for the DoD and actually turns out works great for nonprofits. It's now called the mission model canvas because in the business model canvas we have a box in the bottom right called revenue, and so you tend to measure that. It turns out in the DoD it's not revenue, it's mission achievement or success. The difference between this and an engineering clinic is, number one, we don't start by building a solution. We start by trying to understand what the problem is. And sometimes that, as I mentioned, the Navy example and also the explosive ordnance one, is you think you're building a solution to solve this problem. Well, if that's what you think you do, your goal is you end up building a solution to a problem that might not really exist. So a lot of this is discovery about the problem itself. The second part is actually having a formal framework. For those of you who haven't seen the business or mission model canvas, it actually is kind of I'd say covers about 90% of the things you need to know about commercialization, or in this case, deploying a successful solution for the military. One of the things I remind my class, which makes Pete and Joe smile for the military doesn't lack demos. They have more technical demos from customers, from contractors, from Silicon Valley, from whatever. What they really lack is deployment at speed. And part of the class was teaching them, how do you deploy a product? How do you acquire the funds for the product? And they're going, we're just engineers. How the hell? And so we teach them all those things about deployment, about acquisition, about who do you need for buy-in? Who's the general or the colonel whose career will be retarded? Which contractor is going to screw you if they don't have a piece of this? Stuff you would never think about in an engineering capstone class. Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah, I think that a lot of that makes sense.
Okay.
I mean, you may need to teach a 10-year class to really go through that whole process.
Actually, the good news is that we had generals and others in acquisition sit in the back of that class on week 5 and say, I can't believe, they said, it took us years to understand this. So when you know what it is students and actually people who build product need to know to understand that stuff, you could teach that and concatenate it in a way that literally in weeks rather than months or years. You ought to sit through the class. These guys have built a great curriculum.
Yeah, it's a really interesting approach.
Thank you.
And maybe please a short intro to your background for Steve's sake.
Sure. So my name is Gabriela, and I've been working more with social entrepreneurs recently.
Yes.
And my question is somehow related. So how do we use these frameworks also to solve like super big social
Yep.
problems, and sort of to also bring more good brains to solve really important problems in the world?
So I just did it's very funny you asked that. I just did an online webinar about the mission model canvas, this construct we use to kind of articulate all the hypotheses. Again, developed for the Hacking for Defense class. I did it with Osterwalder, who developed the original business model canvas. We had 1,000 people online, and I'd say 900 of them were for nonprofits who didn't want to use it for military stuff, who said this is perfect for nonprofits. So when as I go just Google mission model canvas, you'll find articles by Alexander Osterwalder and I about describing how to use it. The second part is you could use the same framework of the class that we're doing for Hacking for Defense or diplomacy. And by the way, the time that we do it in, 10 weeks, there's nothing magic about it. I teach a 5-day version of the Lean Launchpad class at NYU in Columbia in a block week. So, and I could even imagine doing it in a hackathon over a weekend. That is, if you set up some goal, here are some sponsored problems, here's the framework of not only we want demos, no, we want you to actually talk to some of these people, we'll show you where to get them and whatever, and do an iteration or a cycle or two, and then show me some MVPs based on you getting out of the building. Not hard to do at all. Okay. Thanks for the question.
My name is Dan. I'm a reporter, so I'm actually doing my job by asking you a question right now. I'm wondering to what do you...
No comment.
What's that?
No comment. No.
To what do you attribute...
Who are you with?
I'm freelancing right now for The Guardian, the UK Guardian.
Great.
So, not the San Francisco Guardian, which is in the ground.
Right, there's an old Bay Guardian, right?
Yeah.
Some of us remember the Bay Guardian.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, to what do you attribute the kind of generational change? You mentioned like the 68 student protests. I mean, those were student-driven protests,
Yep.
and actually changed the university. SRI decoupled.
ISIS YouTube videos.
What's that? YouTube videos?
ISIS YouTube videos.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty clear to explosions in Barcelona, attacks in Paris. Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty clear to most people in the Western world is that we're under attack. At least our safety and security is under attack. We could discuss and maybe disagree about the political underpinnings of what caused that, but the fact is that people are trying to kill us, and they're not just trying to kill us in the U.S., they're trying to kill us in multiple countries.
And to an extent that didn't exist during the Cold War?
No, it's pretty ironic. During the Cold War, during the Cold War, we had ICBMs pointed at each other that could annihilate hundreds of millions of people, but you mostly died of an infected fingernail in the Cold War. You didn't have active people killing each other in the streets, other than wars that we decided to fight, whether they were Vietnam or other places. But you didn't have indiscriminate, civilian populaces targeted. And I'm trying to answer your question about what's changed the psyche, I believe, about, I wouldn't call it the militarization of the American populace, but I think I'm going to give you, are you an American citizen?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to tell, I'm just going to, I'm asking it because something funny happened just in my lifetime. When I came back from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam, people did not say thank you for your service.
Right.
And for those of us old enough to remember what they said, it's probably unprintable in your newspaper. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, people say to people like Joe and others, thank you for your service. Whether they believe in what we're doing or not, they could separate out the contributions of that service person from the policy of the government. That's a much more sophisticated view than I think the country had 30, 40 years ago. I think our students have, and I've been surprised, also have that sophisticated view that says, look, we're not building weapon systems. We're trying to help our military do a better job in keeping us safe and secure. And I think we did surveys before and after the class, and the thing that we were stunned, surprised, and actually felt great about, which we didn't talk about, was the number of students who came in because these were interesting problems. So we asked, did you come in for interesting problems? Did you come in to learn to lean? Or did you come in to help the government keep us safe and secure? And coming in, that was number 3. And going out, that was number 1. And we weren't pitching any of that. They just got to work with our service people from all the branches. And a good number of them who said, I never would have considered doing this, are now continuing those projects. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I think I think the character of the nation has changed. I think the threats have changed. They've become more personal. I think, we could argue about foreign policy in the U.S. I think for me, this is a better way, or at least a way to connect students who would never have the opportunity to get involved with policy. Listen, as far as I'm concerned, if they come out of the class and saying, I think we're a bunch of dorks and we ought to not do this, at least they're speaking from experience, not thinking because you went to college and you got assigned an opinion. And so I think it's going to make, if we could do this at scale, get thousands or tens of thousands of students a year engaged, then we're going to have a very interesting dialogue about how effective and what role our military should play. I personally think we've run a 45-year science experiment about disconnecting the American populace from national defense. I just think the data's in, we made a mistake, that we need some form of national service, and since I can't fix national policy, I could at least hack it, and that's one of the intents of the class.
Cool. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Sorry for the soliloquy. Ask Joe a question. He's actually done stuff.
Hi, Steve and Joel. My name is Michelle. I'm an attorney and also entrepreneur founder. My question is about military and it has nothing to do with my background. I'm just interested in it. I just want to know what your thoughts on disruptions are in military for the next 5 years and how we could compete with rising powers such as China and Russia.
Joe?
Or the embargo countries.
Yeah. Beyond my pay grade.
The short answer, we have to. It's a national security priority. We can't afford to continue the status quo. And everything I think that Steve has described up to now about this course and this approach, it is an urgent national security requirement. So it's not a, do we need to be disrupted? Do we need to get cutting edge technology into the hands of our national security agencies? We have to do it. The good news is I am at a kind of maybe a bit more patriotic than most, but we've got an amazing country full of amazingly talented people. If we can just find a way to harness that, we're going to do it. I feel confident that we can stay and keep our edge if we provide these opportunities for our best and brightest to get involved in ways that Steve has described and others. So it's not going to be easy, but the threat is there. It's something we can't ignore, and we need to bring our best folks to the table to address it.
So Joe said an interesting phrase that you should all think about. When Blockbuster was disrupted by Netflix and online, video, the company went out of business. Okay, we got our video somewhere else. But gee, when you disrupt the U.S. military, or our intelligence agencies, the country goes out of business, or potentially goes out of business. That's pretty irrecoverable. And some of us think that that's not a good outcome. And some of it might be technology disruption, and part of this is to help assure that at least we give our country all we can. So that's the best we can answer that.
Okay, I was looking for the specific, but I think that's
If we
fine.
knew specifics, we wouldn't tell you. We wouldn't tell anybody.
Thank you.
But no, I don't mean you, but in general, one of the things you've got to assume is that within those pile of people at the Department of Defense and their contractors and whatever, they read everything we write and more. And having been inside some of those things, in fact, I was just having coffee with someone who told me the good test about innovation and disruption in any agency or company is when you're reviewing a portfolio of projects, if you're not surprised and stunned, they're not working on the right stuff. And I got to tell you, the places I've been in the last year, my jaw drops every time I come in. So the good news is there's stuff going on that would make you feel great. But it's the classic, but if I told you, I'd have to kill you.
That's cool. I'm an attorney, so most of the stuff that I know, I can't tell.
Great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for talking today, and I'm a big fan. I'm Shri. I'm a mathematician, entrepreneur, and founder. So my question is about the Veterans Affair, where the injured soldiers are waiting, and not getting the required assistance. So since you're a prominent figure, what can you do to help the VA?
Well, it's very funny you say that, because one of the problems that came into our class was the VA came in and offered the students a set of opportunities to work on them. And so we were trying to give the VA some help from our students. Unfortunately, the students picked, I think, some more shiny-looking problems and passed on that one. But one of the great things about scaling this program is that the VA has offered us a set of problems to work on, and we are going to kind of scale. What we're going to set up, and we have set up, is a clearinghouse for all the universities to, instead of going to the DoD themselves, they will go to a clearinghouse of kind of screen problems that Joe and Pete and others will kind of clear up. And you should feel good that the VA is on that list of problems. They were almost first in line. Do you remember them coming in?
Yes.
And they gave a couple of stirring presentations, but
So wanted them to pick that problem.
we wanted them to pick that problem. So the answer is we are working with the VA.
Okay, that's good, because their PR seems to be really broken, right? In news we only hear that people are waiting and they're not getting help. We don't don't hear that they're trying to improve the system.
Right.
So.
Well, again, like any huge agency, it's kind of lumpy. I mean, some parts are incredibly bureaucratic, and some have gotten the message from the Congress and President that says we need to do better for the people who served. And I think that message is slowly percolating. But like any large organization, I think it'll take some time. But you should know they were first in showing, or if not first, within the first 3 military organizations that showed up and said, we need some help.
And coming to our sessions and pitching the problem. There's good people working real hard in that organization, and but it's a big barge to steer. It's a tough problem to address.
Yeah, happy to know that they're trying
Great.
to collaborate. Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you.
for developing the curriculum.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Ileana Montauk, and I've been running a startup accelerator in Gaza for the last few years named Gaza Sky Geeks.
Wow.
And what you said about procurements really resonated with me, because while I was there, I had to run the accelerator as a portion of a larger humanitarian organization, because we needed that structure in order to be able to enter Gaza, in order to stay safe in Gaza. And so I needed to learn the procurement system of this umbrella organization that I was a part of. And part of what I learned during that process was that we, as the little innovative accelerator within this larger, very traditional humanitarian organization, had a very different culture from the rest of our colleagues. And so I just wanted to ask you about culture, and what you, first of all, are the cultures of these students that you're bringing in, the defense people that you're bringing different, and if so, how do you navigate those cultures in order to be able to launch products successfully?
That's a joke question. I mean, you've been living some of this.
So the question, is it a different culture from the students?
Well,
is it a clash?
but mostly, what did you learn about navigating that successfully?
So how do you navigate a JIDA or pick your favorite
With
agency?
students?
Well, with students, and there's an innovator group over here, but it's a much larger military organization. Did we piss them all off, or just some of them? And
Yeah, there was a lot of epiphanies, I think, on both sides. Our students.
why don't you talk about some of the sponsor learning, Joe? I mean, that was.
I think a lot of our sponsors didn't know the problem they had. I think across the board, some of their feedback is we didn't even know how to define the problem that we really had. So I think in almost every case, these students were able to really help their sponsor organizations understand their problem better. Because these were students with no priors, no prejudice. They just came in fresh set eyes with very limited or no experience with this organization.
And Joe, how did innovation work inside of a large military organization?
Yeah, it's tough. There are very innovative people. There's islands of innovation. Connecting them is a challenge. But these are some big organizations that aren't set up to be agile necessarily. But our experience, I think, we call this building an insurgency. You can kind of spot people. I know from my experience in special forces where you can tell the people who are going to be good insurgents. And I think our students help with their customer development process, interviewing. They found the people that could be the insurgents within their own organizations and be change agents. So it's pretty impressive, I think, for all of us. Steve and I, these young students were just they had an amazing way of navigating, of mapping. They could map an organization in ways that even their own organization thought was more accurate than
In
anything
fact, they
they'd
were
ever seen.
borrowing the students' org charts to now use back at, it was the, Arc Cyber was doing that.
So at some level, that's encouraging as teachers. At some level, it's a little disturbing as Americans, but at least they were honest enough to admit that, hey, we learned a lot from these students.
So
in
to
this 10
specifically
weeks.
now I'm thinking about your problem. So specifically, part of this mission model canvas is they need to figure out how do you get buy-in. Yeah. And so buy-in is, what do you mean buy-in? Well, there's always a saboteur. There's always people who want to support the status quo. There's always whatever. Who are they? What do you mean, who are they? Well, they exist. Go figure out how does the org, start with the org chart, and then what's the influence map, and by the way, and how do you get dollars, and which one of these influencer, and the goal, by the way, is not to make a demo or a piece of, how do you get deployment? What's it take and who? Just teaching that rather than, oh, here's the service or product we want to deliver. No, anybody could do that. It's like, no, how do you make that stuff happen? And usually it takes people, process, and dollars to make it happen. That's the other part of the education that I thought was equally valuable, not give me a demo. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if you use a methodology like that, it requires you to kind of understand, oh, it's not just the smartest idea will win and get deployed. No, maybe somebody needs to be bought a trip to Cyprus to be out of town when this happens, or maybe somebody needs like, a new car, or maybe, whatever it takes to, if the goal is to make something happen, then that's what you need to teach. Does that?
Yeah, there's the system side, but then there's the actual people in the positions and
And
how
if
to
you
navigate
and if
that
you don't
culture and those
teach
people.
the teams that that's important, they'll be constantly surprised and frustrated that how come my stuff didn't happen?
And I think the customer discovery process really brings that out. That the students, they were talking to these individuals. They realized organizations weren't monolithic. There was a variety of interests that came to play, and some of it was at odds with each other. So,
Okay. So let's take one last question. Do you have the best question among the four?
I hope so. Thank you both for the discussion. Mine is really about the relationship between Washington, D.C., the government, and Silicon Valley. Maybe I was wrong, but I always thought that Silicon Valley companies have tried to keep government kind of at an arm's length. But now with some of the newer companies like Airbnb, Uber have to become much more involved in regulation policy. If you can do it with the DoD, for example, where do you find that Silicon Valley can really work with the government going forward to help solve some of the nation's biggest problems?
Joe?
a lot of places. I think it's, there's a lot of problems where, there's the whole dual use technology. I think we got a lot of startup CEOs here. No one really wants to work for the DoD full stop, but I think there's opportunities where working with the DoD can provide opportunities, provide that non-dilutive capital, they can still reach their ultimate objectives of scaling, but while along the way really helping an important cause perhaps within the DoD or the intelligence community. So I think identifying those opportunities where these startup companies or these tech companies are really better off, can be empowered by working or by supporting the military or the intelligence community. So looking for those. There's some, we're not going to want to build aircraft carriers or nuclear submarines from the startup community, but there's a lot of other opportunities.
That's a good idea.
To contribute. Maybe
I'd like
Steve
to
could
build
figure out a way to do that. But I think finding those opportunities where they really are, those dual use opportunities where they really can be empowered to realize their goals by working with the military along the way.
And for those of you who are interested in seeing more about this Hacking for Defense class, if you go to the website steveblank.com, there's a category on the left called Hacking for Defense. You just click on it, you'll see the summary of all the teams, some videos, links to the class website. Again, steveblank.com, category on the left-hand side called Hacking for Defense, and you'll see more than you ever wanted to know about this class. So thank you all so much for coming.
Steve, I just asked for one last question, but I'm going to make it a comment to close with, because we've addressed most of it, unless you want to talk about what's next. But
yep.
I couldn't let that anecdote about you coming back from Southeast Asia, Vietnam era veteran, and not being thanked for your service go without acknowledging what I think Steve has started here and we're trying to take forward. It is going to be a national service. We've got students who really want to get involved in national public service and making a difference. So Steve, on behalf of certainly me and I hope all of us here, thank you for your service. Thanks for all you're doing to
Thank you,
have an
Jim.
impact.
Thanks. Thanks.
All right.
Well, I hope you enjoyed tonight's event brought to you by Idea to IPO and the Commonwealth Club Silicon Valley. I want to thank Steve Blank, Joe Felter, and all of you for coming. And now this meeting is adjourned.